What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today, and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There is a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in the short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? Or Killing Columbus. I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. There were 2 huge campaigns of mass deportations of Mexicans in the United States, in the 1930s and the 1950s. The official government name for the second, believe it or not, was Operation Wetback. U.S. troops, federal agents, and local police carried out neighborhood sweeps, seizures, and deportations of 3.8 million people, mostly Mexican Americans, not Mexican citizens. 60% American citizens. There were 2.3 million kicked out in the 30s, up to a third of the entire Mexican American population, and 1.5 million kicked out in the 1950s. The Mexican population in the U.S. has been there since before it was the United States. There were perhaps 100,000 Mexicans in the Southwest at the time the U.S. invaded to seize Texas for a slave state, plus perhaps 400,000 natives, 300,000 in California alone. For the first 75 years, the border meant very little. There was no border patrol until 1924. There were no passports or visas until 1918. People and goods routinely crossed with no one stopping them or caring. There would be no border wall until anywhere between the U.S. and Mexico until 1911, and walls always fail. Walls failed in China, Israel, Berlin, and between Mexico and the U.S. In both World Wars, the U.S. government invited in and U.S. companies recruited hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers. They also recruited again during the 1920s. But like any other economic hard time, during the Great Depression, Mexicans were an easy scapegoat. This happened in one of the most racist periods in U.S. history, when the KKK and other racist groups numbered in the millions, and pseudoscientific racism like eugenics were mainstream. President Hoover needed a scapegoat for his own failures to stop the Depression or aid the public. Hoover, with his Secretary of Labor, Doak, added about 250 more agents to deport 500,000 so-called foreigners. The new measures included monitoring protests and strikes, labeling protesters as subversives, communists, or radicals. Protesters were then arrested, charged with being illegal aliens whether they were or not, and arbitrarily deported. How could this mass deportation be defeated? Obviously, if Hoover had been defeated. His opponent was Al Smith, mostly remembered as the first Catholic with a chance to become the U.S. president. Smith's parents were both immigrants, an Irish father and an Italian mother. Smith lost by a 17-point landslide, partly because of anti-Catholic prejudice, but also a good economy for the wealthy and middle class, and a failure to redistribute the Electoral College for population growth. A weaker economy means Smith may win. No mass deportation in the 1930s make it less likely to happen in the 1950s. 2 million more Mexicans in the U.S. then means as many as 16 million more Mexican Americans in the U.S. today, the numbers jumping from 60 to 76 million. It means an earlier and stronger civil rights movement, and elections turning out differently. Kennedy's win in 1960 would not be close. Nixon would also lose in 1968, perhaps never becoming president. There will be no Watergate, and no Cambodian genocide, and the Vietnam War will end sooner. Trump would lose by an even larger margin in 2016, including the Electoral College. That means there are no Muslim bans or immigrant children in cages. In the 1950s, Operation Wetback was ordered by President Eisenhower. This time it was during a period of prosperity, at least for the middle class. The U.S. had actually recruited millions of Mexicans to work in the U.S. during World War II and after, the Bracero program. Braceros were temporary laborers under contract, but they had no legal rights. As the war's end was farther away, there was less need for Mexican labor. Race prejudice targeted these workers, ending the program and then targeting all Mexicans. The man most responsible for Operation Wetback, who pushed Eisenhower into it, was Harlan Carter. At 17, Carter murdered a Mexican boy of 15. He falsely accused the boy of auto theft and shot and killed him. Harlan Carter only served 2 years for this murder. Then he joined the Border Patrol, eventually becoming its leader. Most of all, Harlan Carter is remembered for turning the National Rifle Association from a mostly moderate gun safety group that actually favored gun control to a radical right-wing collection of conspiracy nuts, racists, and others who dominate gun control politics. The simplest way and the most just way and ironic way to prevent Operation Wetback is if Harlan Carter is killed by the Mexican boy during that murder attempt. No Harlan Carter doesn't just mean a larger Latino population with a larger and sooner civil rights movement and changes to elections and how they turn out. It also means an NRA that is not a powerful lobby in America. When mass shootings start to increase, the U.S. passes gun control much like happened in Australia. The murder rate, suicide rate, and especially mass shootings and the rise of militias in the U.S. are all far less. The last one means, even if Trump somehow does become president in 2016, the January 6th coup attempt in 2021, attempted by militias like the Oath Keepers and the 7 Percenters and others, is less likely, or with fewer people. Fewer conspiracy nuts means fewer people radicalized into treason. This is the end of the video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss, what if Roosevelt invades Brazil?